war with Germany. Fierce fighting broke out in France, which had been the victim of German invasion. Now British troops joined their French allies in a series of battles that would become infamous for their bloody slaughter. The British had gone to war with bullish confidence. All over by Christmas, the politicians had said. But that deadline had long gone, and still British blood was being shed, lots of it. The king had not been one of those who sought war, so it was with a heavy heart that he carried out his duty to recruit more men. Mary made her point by wearing black, in mourning. Most public speakers, however, were ferocious in their enthusiasm for the war. All over the country, young men were inspired into joining up. The stream of new recruits became a flood. George, meanwhile, was worried about his second son Bertie, who was about to see action in the Navy. So when the king turned up to give Bertie's battleship the once-over, the entire ship's company turned out. The king even joined in the crew's official photograph and tried out one or two navy blue jokes on the ship's company. Far away, on the Eastern Front, the war was not going well for the Allies. Someone in the War Office had thought up a cunning plan, and it was about to be activated. Ships of the Royal Navy would blast the steep hills of a Turkish peninsula called Gallipoli, and as soon as the thin line of defenders had been scattered, troops from British Commonwealth countries would take the heights and open up a pathway straight through to Russia. When these Allied troops, mostly Australians and New Zealanders, hit the beaches, they would receive a dreadful surprise. Instead of the handful of frightened Turks they had been told to expect, they were met by devastating fire from a brilliantly drilled professional force. "36,000 Allied soldiers would be killed in the Gallipoli campaign, and the heights would never be taken." Gallipoli would become a word meaning both tragic disaster and place of valour. For one New Zealand soldier, Corporal Trevor Sharp, it would mean winning his country's first ever Victoria Cross, awarded by King George himself. While back on the Western Front, the King would soon present another Victoria Cross, this time to a wonderfully mad Scotsman called Piper Laidlaw. By 1916, the King had become a regular visitor to the Western Front, where morale was at a low ebb. In April, George brought along his eldest son Edward, now the Prince of Wales, in the hope that the prince's legendary charm would stiffen a few backbones. It didn't work. Edward was having one of his sulks. He was depressed because his father wouldn't let him become a fighting man, and he was jealous of his brother Bertie, who, as a junior officer on the cruiser Cumberland, had been plunged into the Battle of Jutland. Bertie had fought bravely throughout a long and fierce action and was commended in dispatches. But then he fell ill, and he was sent home to raise money for military hospitals. All this time, Queen Mary had been doing the royal rounds on the home front. Today it was a working-class suburb in Glasgow. All these improvised chats with strangers were doing wonders for Mary's confidence. In France, the British artillery was still trying to smash the German lines with endless shell fire, and they now depended on a startlingly different supply line. With so many men needed in the trenches, women were increasingly being used as munitions workers. While far away in Russia, there was the scent of red revolution in the air. The communist firebrand Lenin was about to apply the torch. A rebel force stormed the palace and put the Russian royal family in prison. This was alarming news for King George. Tsar Nicholas was his cousin. A sinister new dawn, George feared, would soon sweep away all the monarchs of Europe. Indeed, his other cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, absolute ruler of Germany and their official war leader, had just been sacked by his own generals. Where will it all end? The king was heard to mutter. George had every right to feel cross. There he was, doing his patriotic best for the country he loved so much, and yet appalling rumours were circulating that he and his dear wife were secretly pro-German. A fever of anti-German hatred was sweeping through Britain. Anyone with a German name was attacked. George knew that it was time to act. His family name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, was unmistakably German. It would have to be changed. Back in Windsor Castle, as he discussed this painful question with his private secretary, he looked around the ancient castle that had always been the family retreat. It was here that kings had kneeled in prayer through the centuries, and where their bones now lay buried. He knew then what the new name for his royal family would have to be: Windsor. Back at the war, it was deadly business as usual. Thousands of men killed in a single day for a gain of 100 meters. And the next day, the same numbers killed for the loss of the same ground. A war of attrition, they called it, with young men's lives sacrificed to wear the enemy down. And the lucky ones, so they said, were those too maimed to ever fight again. Far away from the horror, but keenly aware of it, George and Mary were doing their utmost to set a good example to their war-weary subjects, now that food rationing had been introduced. They cut down on the royal meals, ate meat only twice a week, and shared homegrown vegetables from their huge gardens at Sandringham with local villagers. Yet something dramatic had to be done to turn the tide of a war that seemed to have no end. George accepted the resignation of the Prime Minister, Lord Asquith, knowing that Lloyd George, a man he did not like, would make a better war leader. But there was good news in the air. The Yanks were coming, on a wing and a prayer and a throw of the dice. Soon whole battalions of them were parading before King George and a rather statuesque Queen Mary. Now the Allies were riding high, with explosive new power in the air, and with new weapons called tanks to support the enormous shove by fresh American troops. In no time, it seemed, the mighty German forces were surrendering. After 4 years of bitter, bloody conflict, it was all over. A wild spirit of joy seized hold of Londoners and swept them along to their common destination, the gates of Buckingham Palace. And up there on the balcony were those two modest figures who'd seen the nation through its worst ever crisis and emerged as George and Mary Windsor. At last George could relax, doing what he loved best, sailing his beloved yacht in calm English waters. For the first time in his life, he was a man and a monarch who was sure of himself and of the country over which he reigned. Follow a country lane, and you'd swear that tradition still ruled, that the Great War had left no lasting wounds. But in cities and towns all over Britain, hungry men wandered the streets looking for work, but the jobs had gone. At war's end, the government had promised returning servicemen a world fit for heroes. It was a promise that had a bitter ring to it now. 1.5 million men were on the dole, and industry was crippled by strikes. One strike would even stop work on the British Empire exhibition, which the King was expected to open, eventually. Still, no disloyal strikers could prevent George from honouring the memory of his late father, Edward VII, and Alexandra, the Queen Mother, was there too for the unveiling. At least George was still a reigning monarch, which was more than you could say for his cousin the Kaiser, who after losing the war had been deposed. And as for his Russian cousin, Tsar Nicholas, whom George remembered as an awesome imperial figure, he and his entire family had been murdered by the Bolsheviks. Even the King of Serbia had been forced into exile, and so had the last in a long, exotic line, the Sultan of Turkey. While King Alphonse of Spain feared that his country might go the way of France and become that most dreaded of things, a republic. At least the royal house of Windsor was secure, wasn't it? By the early 1920s, George's anxiety about the future of his own empire had returned. Ireland had become a seething trouble spot. British troops had been sent there in the King's name to flush out these troublesome Irish rebels. Unfortunately, the troubleshooters, known as the Black and Tans, inflamed Irish opinion with their own brutal tactics. All over Europe, crowned heads were under threat. In Italy, the Black Shirts marched on Rome, and in a decision he would live to regret, King Victor Emmanuel would give his blessing to a fascist government headed by a man called Mussolini. But absurd foreigners in Ireland or Italy made no impression on the social set that swirled around the British royal circle. King George and Queen Mary, of course, but also Alexandra, the Queen Mother, with all her dogs. Then there was Princess Mary, the King's only daughter, who was soon to be married. But the star of the moment was Edward, Prince of Wales, who'd just returned from a world tour. In Tokyo, he'd march with Prince Hirohito, heir to Japan's throne. And back home, he would be the lion of house parties and the hunt, and the polo field. Not to mention being best man at the wedding of Lord Louis Mountbatten. The king, who knew his son better than his admirers, was not impressed by all this pointless gallivanting. Meanwhile, back in the real world, a group of young enthusiasts had been experimenting with one of those modern inventions that King George so distrusted, when suddenly...
2LO Marconi House, London, calling. 2LO Marconi House, London, calling.
The world's first radio broadcasting company was on the air. The king's suspicion of this thing called wireless would be overcome when he realized its power to unite people. Another thing that George disliked was socialism, especially when it was on the march in his kingdom, stirring people up. So in 1924, when Britain elected its first ever Labour government, George was appalled at the prospect of meeting the new Prime Minister.